The little girl pressed her cheek against Josephine Kendrick's open palm, closed her eyes like she was tasting something sweet on the air, and whispered the words that cracked every wall Josephine had ever built around her broken heart. "You smell like someone who belongs here." Josephine stood absolutely frozen in the doorway of the weathered ranch house, the desert wind pulling at her dark hair, her chest so tight she could not draw a full breath. The child, this small, serious, golden-haired girl of no more than 6 years old, held her hand the way a person holds something they are terrified to lose. And Josephine, who had ridden 400 miles to escape a life full of secrets and betrayal, who had told herself she was done trusting anyone, who had sworn on her own mother's grave that she would never let herself need a place or a person again, felt the ground beneath her feet shift like sand in a flash flood. Behind the child, silhouetted in the brilliant amber fire of a New Mexico sunset, stood Roscoe Reed. He was not looking at his daughter. He was looking at Josephine. And the expression on his face, raw, unguarded, almost frightened, told her that he had heard every word, that those words had done something to him too, something he had no name for and no armor against. Neither of them spoke. The wind moved between them, carrying dust and the smell of sage and the distant low moan of cattle from somewhere past the ridge. And Josephine understood, in the terrifying clarity of that single frozen moment, that everything was about to become far more complicated than any plan she had made for herself. She had not come here looking for love. She had come here running from a trap. And now, standing in the red light of a dying day with a child's cheek warm against her palm, and the gaze of a man she had known for exactly 11 days burning into her like a brand, she was no longer certain she could tell the difference between the two. But to understand how they had arrived at this doorstep, this breathless, impossible threshold, you would have to go back to the beginning of it, to the dust and the danger and all the dark and hidden things that had driven Josephine Kendrick out of Abilene and into the most unexpected story of her life. It was the spring of 1884. Abilene, Kansas was no longer the roaring cattle town it had been in its prime, but it still carried the skeleton of that wildness in its bones. The long, straight Main Street, the saloons that never went fully quiet, the men who moved through it like they owned whatever they could see and intended to take whatever they could not. Josephine was 27 years old and had spent the last 3 years working as a bookkeeper for a man named Gerald Prentice, who owned the largest dry goods operation in the county and who had a reputation for fair dealing that Josephine had eventually discovered was entirely fabricated. She had found the hidden ledgers on a Thursday afternoon in March. 2 sets of books, one for the county assessor, one for the truth. Gerald Prentice had been underpaying his suppliers by routing their payments through a series of false accounts, skimming the difference, and reporting phantom losses to avoid taxation. It was fraud on a scale that would have impressed a railroad baron, executed with the patience and precision of a man who had been doing it so long he no longer even thought of it as wrong. Josephine had sat at that desk for a long time, staring at the numbers, understanding exactly what she was looking at, and understanding with equal clarity what it meant for her. She was the bookkeeper. She was the one whose name appeared on the legal accounting documents. If this ever came to light, Gerald Prentice would hand her those documents and say she had done it all herself, and there was not a judge in Kansas who would believe a woman over a man of Gerald Prentice's standing and social connections. She had 2 choices: stay and become complicit in the ongoing deception with her name on documents that could destroy her, or run. She ran. She went home that night and packed 1 trunk and a travel bag. She withdrew every dollar she had saved, $214, from the small savings account she had maintained at the Abilene National Bank. She wrote a single letter and left it for her landlady, a kind older woman named Mrs. Farrow, and she asked Mrs. Farrow to mail it only if Josephine had not returned within 30 days. The letter was addressed to the county sheriff and contained a full accounting of what she had discovered in Gerald Prentice's private ledgers, including dates, amounts, and the names of the false accounts. It was the only insurance she had. If Gerald Prentice came after her, and she believed he would, because men like Gerald Prentice did not tolerate loose ends, then at least the truth would eventually surface. She took the southbound train out of Abilene before sunrise on Friday, changed trains in Wichita, and rode west and south through the long, dry country, watching Kansas give way to Indian Territory, and then to the vast empty reach of eastern New Mexico. She had read an advertisement in a newspaper 3 weeks earlier, a small column notice seeking a schoolteacher for a town called Blue Rock, New Mexico, a settlement of perhaps 300 souls in the Rio Grande Basin. She had no formal teaching credentials, but she had a better education than most women of her time and circumstance, having been privately tutored by a father who believed in reading as a form of survival. She had pulled that advertisement from the paper and kept it folded in her coat pocket through days of uncertainty, the way a person holds a compass when they are not sure which direction to go. Blue Rock was not much to look at when she stepped off the stage that had carried her the last 40 miles from the rail terminus at Socorro. It was a scatter of adobe buildings and wooden storefronts along a single main street, with a church at one end and a livery stable at the other, and a permanent layer of red dust over every horizontal surface. But it was far from Abilene. It was far from Gerald Prentice. And the woman who ran the town's small boarding house, a compact, energetic widow named Dorothea Vance, greeted Josephine with a warm handshake, and the information that the town's school committee was meeting the following Tuesday. Josephine met the school committee on that Tuesday morning, presented her qualifications honestly, answered their questions directly, and was offered the position at a salary of $35 a month plus a small residential allowance. She accepted on the spot. She spent the rest of that week settling into a 2-room rental behind Dorothea Vance's boarding house, airing out the schoolroom that had been closed since the previous teacher had left in October, and trying very hard not to think about what she had left behind or what might be following her. She was buying flour and salt pork at the general store on her 6th day in Blue Rock when she heard the argument. It was coming from the street outside, 2 men's voices, one low and controlled and one loud and escalating toward something mean. She stepped to the window and saw them, a heavy-set man in a brown coat who was gesturing with both hands in the aggressive, proprietary way of someone who considers themselves owed something, and a taller man in worn, range clothes and a battered hat who stood very still and said nothing, which seemed to infuriate the man in the brown coat even further. "You have until the end of the month, Reed, and I am not extending that deadline again," the man in the brown coat said, loudly enough that Josephine could hear every word through the store's open door. "The water rights transfer has to be filed before the 30th. You sign those papers or I go to the magistrate and we do this a harder way." The man called Reed turned his head slowly and looked at the man in the brown coat with an expression of such absolute, bone-deep weariness that Josephine felt it from 20 feet away. "You will have your answer before the 30th, he said quietly, and turned away. The man in the brown coat said something else, something uglier, something Josephine did not quite catch, but she heard the word widow's land and the word dead man's debts, and she saw the taller man stop walking for just a moment, his shoulders going rigid, before he continued on down the street without looking back. She asked Dorothea Vance about it that evening over supper. "That was Silas Boone," Dorothea said, setting down her fork and folding her hands in the manner of someone settling in for a story that has a complicated history. "He is attempting to acquire the Lazier Ranch, which belongs to Roscoe Reed, or rather to Roscoe and his daughter Clara. Roscoe's wife, Ellen, passed away 2 years ago this past winter. Fever. It was very sudden." She paused and pressed her lips together in the way that indicated a loss still felt by the community. "Roscoe has been running that ranch alone since then. It is a good piece of land, sits on top of one of the best underground water sources in this part of the territory. Silas Boone has been trying to get his hands on the water rights for years. Now with Roscoe carrying some debt from a bad cattle season, Silas sees his opportunity. Is Roscoe going to lose the ranch? Josephine asked. Dorothy sighed. He might, unless he can settle the debt and hold those water rights. He has until the end of April. Josephine did not know Roscoe Reed. She had not yet spoken a word to him. She had no logical reason to feel anything particular about his situation. And yet she found herself thinking about it, about that expression of absolute weariness on his face, about a little girl growing up on land her mother had lived on, about a man standing very still in the face of something mean. As she lay awake that night listening to the wind move through the desert grasses outside her window, she met him properly the following Sunday at the church social that served as Blue Rock's primary community gathering. He was sitting at the end of a long trestle table with a small girl beside him, the girl being very precise about the arrangement of her food on her plate in the way that serious children often are, and Roscoe Reed was watching her with the specific kind of attention that belongs to parents who have learned to find their joy in small specific things. Dorothea introduced them. Roscoe Reed stood and removed his hat and said, "Ma'am, welcome to Blue Rock." He had dark eyes set deep under straight brows, a jaw that was going to be handsome even when it was old, and hands that were large and careful and brown from the sun. He was 31 years old, she would learn that later, and he looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had simply adjusted his posture to accommodate the weight. "I am the new school teacher," Josephine said, because she did not know what else to say. "I know," he said. "Clara will be in your class starting Monday." He indicated the small girl, who looked up from her plate and regarded Josephine with the kind of frank, unhurried assessment that children are capable of when they have not yet learned to pretend they are not looking. "Hello," Josephine said to her. "Hello," Clara said. "Do you know how to read maps?" "My papa has lots of maps, but nobody ever teaches maps at school." "I do know how to read maps," Josephine said, genuinely delighted. "I can teach maps." Clara considered this carefully, then nodded once, apparently satisfied, and returned her attention to her food. Roscoe Reed looked at Josephine over his daughter's head with an expression that was complicated and warm and a little bit startled, and Josephine felt something move in her chest that she did not examine too closely. She told herself it was only the relief of being welcomed somewhere. She told herself it was only the pleasure of a child's direct honesty. She told herself a great many things over the following days, none of which were entirely true, and all of which were entirely necessary for her continued functioning as a person who was supposed to be keeping herself safe and uninvolved. Clara was in the schoolroom on Monday morning when Josephine arrived, sitting in the front row, with a composition book and a slate and a look of absolute readiness. There were 11 other children in the school, ranging in age from 6 to 13, and Josephine taught them all in the single room, which was the standard practice of the time. She divided them by ability rather than age, organized their lessons in rotating blocks, and spent her afternoons preparing materials and correspondence with the county school board. She was good at teaching. She had not known she would be, but she was. She liked the directness of children, the way they either understood something or they did not, the way their faces changed when a concept finally settled into place behind their eyes. And Clara Reed was particularly remarkable, not only intelligent but deeply observant, the kind of child who noticed things adults overlooked and stored them away with careful precision. On the second Thursday, Clara stayed after school while the other children left, and she sat at her desk drawing in her composition book while Josephine cleaned the slates and organized the reading primers. After a while, Clara said, without looking up from her drawing, "My papa was watching you from the road this morning." Josephine paused in her work. "Oh," she said, keeping her voice neutral. "He does that sometimes. He rides past on his way to the feed store and he slows down," Clara said. She still did not look up. "He does not do that for other people." Josephine did not know what to say to that either, which was becoming a regular condition in her interactions with Clara Reed. It was on the following Saturday that Roscoe Reed came to the schoolroom to fix the broken window latch that had been allowing the desert wind to bang the shutters every night. Josephine was there, working on lesson plans, and he knocked on the open door before entering and said he had brought his tools and would not be long. He worked in silence for a while and she worked in silence, and then he said, without turning from his work, "I hear you told the children about the stars, the Greek names." "The constellations, yes," Josephine said. "We were talking about navigation. Clara told me about Orion," he said. "She could not stop talking about it for 2 days. She says she is going to name our next cattle dog Orion." Josephine laughed. It surprised her, the laugh, how easily it came out. She had not laughed genuinely in quite some time. "She is a remarkable child," she said. He turned then and looked at her directly. "She is everything I have got," he said simply, with no dramatic weight to it, just the plain truth of a man who has lost things and knows exactly what remains. Something in Josephine went very quiet. "I know something about that," she said, "about having one thing that you hold on to." He waited, and she did not explain further, and he did not press, and that restraint, that careful respect for what was not offered, was the moment she began, almost without her own permission, to trust him. She learned his history in pieces over the following weeks, the way you learn a landscape gradually, by riding through it rather than reading a map. He had been born in East Texas, raised on cattle and hard weather, had come west with his wife Ellen when they were both 23, drawn by the homestead land available in New Mexico territory. Ellen had been a strong woman, energetic and capable, who had loved this land with a devotion that Roscoe said had always slightly bewildered him even as he admired it. When she died in the winter of 1882, she had been 30 years old, and Clara had been 4, and Roscoe had kept the ranch running by an act of pure stubborn will. He did not talk about Ellen often, but when he did, he spoke of her with honesty, her qualities and her flaws both, which told Josephine more about his character than any amount of flattery would have. A man who could love someone truly and still see them clearly was a rare and serious thing. He learned her history in pieces too, and she gave him pieces she had never given anyone else. She told him she had left a difficult situation in Abilene, which was technically true. She told him she had worked in accounting, which was also true. She did not tell him about the hidden ledgers or Gerald Prentice or the letter waiting at Mrs. Farrow's boarding house in Abilene, set to be mailed in 23 days if she did not return. Some secrets you keep not out of deception but out of terror, and Josephine was not yet ready to hand anyone that particular terror. What she did give him was her actual self, her opinions, her humor, her stubborn streak, her tendency to argue back when she thought something was wrong, her habit of reading by lamplight until her eyes gave out. And he received all of it with a quiet attention that made her feel, uncomfortably and wonderfully, entirely seen. The dinner happened on the last Friday in March. It was Clara's idea, officially. She announced it to Josephine at school with the businesslike air of someone presenting a proposal they have already decided will be accepted, saying that her papa was making his special beef stew that he only made on special occasions, and that Miss Kendrick should come because Miss Kendrick had taught her about maps, which was the most important thing she had learned in school, and that was reason enough for a special occasion. Roscoe, Clara reported, had agreed. Josephine accepted, because refusing Clara was nearly impossible, and because every instinct she possessed told her she should make any excuse not to go, and she had been listening to fear-based instincts her whole life, and was becoming aware of what they cost. The Laziar Ranch was 4 miles south of Blue Rock, accessible by a road that passed through a low arroyo before opening into a wide flat valley with the blue ridge of the Magdalena Mountains visible in the west. The ranch house was a solid, 2-story adobe structure with a wide porch, older than Roscoe's occupation of it, clearly well-maintained by hands that cared about what they were keeping. The barn was large and in good repair. The corrals were clean and well fenced. You could see the love of labor in every detail, the specific pride of a person who works hard at things, not to impress anyone but because the work itself matters. Roscoe met her at the gate when she arrived in the small rented buggy, took her horse's head with a practiced hand, and said, "You found it all right," in the understated tone of a man who has never been good at saying he is glad to see someone. "Clara drew me a map," Josephine said. He smiled, which changed his entire face, softened the weathered angles of it, put a warmth in those dark eyes that she felt in her sternum. "Of course she did," he said. The stew was extraordinary, slow-cooked with dried chilies and root vegetables, and something aromatic she eventually identified as dried juniper berries, which he said he had learned from an old Navajo rancher who had worked the property back when his father-in-law had first homesteaded the land. Clara sat across the table and conducted most of the conversation, moving efficiently between topics, maps, star names, the behavior of the ranch's 2 dogs, a question about whether fish dreamed, a detailed account of something that had happened between 2 of her classmates that she described as a serious diplomatic failure in a tone of genuine scholarly concern, while Roscoe and Josephine spoke around and through and with her, and the lamplight made everything warm and possible. After Clara was in bed and the dishes were done, they sat on the porch in the cool night air with the stars enormous overhead and the distant sound of the creek and Roscoe's old dog sleeping at their feet. They talked for a long time, easy and wide-ranging, the way people talk when they are comfortable enough to not fill silences with noise. And somewhere in the middle of it, Josephine said, without quite planning to, "I'm afraid of something catching up with me." She felt him go very still beside her. "Something in Abilene," he said. "Something in Abilene," she confirmed. He was quiet for a moment. "Is it the law?" "No," she said. "It is the opposite of the law, actually." He did not ask more. He sat with it for a while, and then he said, carefully, "Whatever it is, it will not find you here without going through people who will not make it easy." He said it without flourish, without making it a declaration, just the plain statement of a man who means what he says. And that was the moment, that quiet, practical promise in the dark. That was the moment Josephine Kendrick understood that she was in genuine danger, and not from Gerald Prentice. She rode home that night telling herself 100 practical things, that she was a grown woman with responsibilities and sense, that she was not going to complicate her carefully rebuilt life, that she was in a precarious situation that required her to remain unattached and mobile and focused. Every thought was correct. None of them helped. 2 days later, everything changed. She came into the general store on a Monday morning in the first week of April and found a man there she had never seen before, talking to the storekeeper, Morton Hayes, in a manner that was too casual by half. The man was medium height with a quality of stillness to him that Josephine recognized, having known several men in Abilene who were paid to find people. She browsed quietly and listened. He was asking about a woman who had recently arrived in the area. He described a woman of Josephine's approximate height and coloring who was educated and had come from Kansas. Her heart turned to ice. She purchased her items without looking at the man, kept her voice easy and her movements unhurried, and walked directly from the store to the church where she sat in the empty pew and made herself breathe. Prentice had found her. He had sent someone, which meant her insurance. The letter at Mrs. Farrow's had either not deterred him or he had found a way to neutralize it. She needed to think. She needed help. And the only person in Blue Rock she trusted enough to tell the full truth to was a man she had been trying very hard not to need. She rode to the Lazier that afternoon, arriving as the light was going long and golden over the valley. Roscoe was at the corral, working with a young horse, and he saw her coming while she was still at the gate. He handed the lead rope to a ranch hand and walked to meet her, reading her face as she dismounted. "Tell me," he said. And she did. All of it. The hidden ledgers, the fraudulent accounts, the desperate flight from Abilene, the letter at Mrs. Farrow's boarding house, and the man in the general store this morning who had been asking questions. She told him everything, standing beside her horse in the late afternoon light, and her voice only shook once, which she considered a reasonable performance under the circumstances. Roscoe listened without interrupting. He stood with his arms crossed and his hat pushed back and his eyes on her face, and he listened to every word, and when she was done he said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "What is the man's name, the one in the store?" "I do not know," Josephine said, "but he works for Gerald Prentice. I know that type. I have seen enough of them." Roscoe nodded slowly. "Did Morton Hayes recognize you from the description?" Josephine thought about it. "I do not think so. I came in after the man. Morton saw me as a regular customer. He may not have connected it." "Then we have a little time," Roscoe said. He unfolded his arms and straightened. "First, the letter at Mrs. Farrow's house. When is it due to be mailed?" 18 days from now," Josephine said. "I left on the 2nd of March. She mails it in 30 days. "That letter is your protection," Roscoe said. "As long as it exists and Prentice knows it exists, he cannot act against you without bringing the fraud to light himself. The question is whether he knows about the letter." Josephine had not thought of it quite that clearly. "If he does not know about it, then he thinks he can simply remove you and the problem goes away," Roscoe said. "And the man in the store is meant to do that removing." He said it calmly, with no drama, which was somehow both more frightening and more steadying than alarm would have been. "So we need to make sure he knows about the letter." It was a plan that required boldness to border on recklessness, but Roscoe worked through the logic of it with a methodical patience that Josephine found anchoring. He knew a man in Socorro, a lawyer named Alderman Webb who handled legal filings for the territory, who could draft an anonymous communication to Prentice's Abilene office, making it clear that documentation of the fraudulent accounts was currently in the hands of parties who would transmit it to county law enforcement in the event of any harm coming to one Josephine Kendrick. It would be sent by telegram, untraceable, explicit. If Prentice was the calculating man Josephine believed him to be, the calculus would change immediately. The benefit of removing her would be outweighed by the risk. "And the man he sent," Josephine said. "I know every man in Blue Rock and within 20 miles of it," Roscoe said. "A stranger asking questions is not going to be hard to track. I will talk to the sheriff. Sam Briggs is an honest man. He will keep an eye on things." "Why are you doing this?" Josephine said, and she meant it as a genuine question, not a challenge. She looked at him in the late light and asked honestly, because she did not understand it. "You have enough trouble of your own with Sela's Boone and the water rights and the debt. You do not need this." He looked back at her for a moment, and the thing she saw in his face was not heroism or obligation or even simple kindness. It was something older and quieter than any of those. "Because you told me the truth," he said, "and because no one who is trying to do right deserves to be hunted for it." She had to look away from him then. The desert was doing something violent with the sunset, orange and crimson, and a deep purple at the edges of the sky, and she fixed her eyes on it because it was safer than continuing to look at Roscoe Reed. "All right," she said. "Let us do it." The telegram was sent to Socorro the next morning through a trusted channel Roscoe arranged with a rider who traveled regularly to the rail terminus. Alderman Webb, whom Roscoe reached by correspondence through the same rider, agreed to draft and send the appropriate communication to Prentice within 3 days. In the meantime, Roscoe spoke quietly with Sheriff Sam Briggs, a lanky, weathered man of 50-something who had been maintaining order in Blue Rock for 12 years, and who listened to Roscoe's account with the serious attention of a man who had seen enough of the world to know that fraud and intimidation were not exotic crimes in the New Mexico territory. The stranger from the general store was identified by the end of the week. His name was Dutch Harlan, and he had a modest reputation in the territory as a finder of missing persons, not a violent man by trade, more of an investigator who passed information to those who had hired him. Briggs paid Dutch Harlan a quiet official visit at the boarding house where he had taken a room, and informed him in the polite but unmistakable way of a veteran lawman that his activities in Blue Rock were of official interest, and that he was welcome to move on at his earliest convenience. Dutch Harlan left on the southbound stage 2 days later. The threat did not disappear entirely. Prentice was still out there, the letter was still waiting, the deadline was still coming, but the immediate danger had receded, and Josephine could breathe again. What she could not do, it turned out, was maintain the careful emotional distance she had been attempting to maintain from Roscoe Reed. It happened gradually and then suddenly, as these things always do. She was at the Lazier on a Saturday to return a book Roscoe had lent her, a battered copy of David Copperfield that he had packed all the way from East Texas, and that Clara had been trying to get through for the past 2 months with limited success, due to her ongoing conviction that Dickens used unnecessary words. Clara was helping with the chickens when Josephine arrived, and Roscoe was at the kitchen table writing correspondence, and the scene was so entirely domestic and so entirely different from the rigid, lonely competence of Josephine's Abilene years that she stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment and felt something in her chest break open like the earth in spring. He looked up and saw her face, and he put down his pen and he said, "What is it?" She shook her head. "Nothing, I am just—" She stopped. "Just what?" he said. "Grateful," she said finally. "That is the word. I am simply grateful." He stood up from the table and crossed the kitchen to where she stood, and he stopped close enough that she could see the particular shade of his eyes in the morning light, which were not quite black but a very dark brown, and he said, with the same quiet simplicity he brought to everything, "I think you should know that I have been looking for reasons to come to town on days when I do not need to come to town." The confession, delivered without embellishment, was more devastating than any declaration of feeling would have been. "You should probably stop doing that," she said. "It is wasteful of travel time." "I know," he said. "I have not stopped." She laughed, and then she stopped laughing because he was looking at her with an expression so undefended that it was almost painful to receive, and she said very quietly, "Roscoe, I have secrets that I am still carrying." "I know," he said again. "And I am not certain this town is safe for me yet." "I know that too, and I am not a simple person," she said. "I am stubborn and I argue and I form strong opinions about things, and I am not good at asking for help." "I noticed all of those things," he said. "I noticed them in approximately this order: the opinions, the stubbornness, the arguing, and the difficulty with help. In that order." She looked at him. "You are not deterred." "Not even slightly," he said. She reached up and put her hand against the side of his face, and he closed his eyes for just a moment the way a man does when he receives something he had not let himself expect, and she said, "Then I suppose we are in this together." He covered her hand with his and held it there, and the kitchen was warm, and the desert morning light was pouring through the window, and somewhere outside Clara was scolding a chicken in a tone of great reasonableness, and it was not a kiss, not yet, but it was the full acknowledgment of something that had already been building between them for weeks, something that had grown up quietly in the spaces between practical conversations and borrowed books and long evenings on the porch. "In this together," he confirmed. But together, as it turned out, still had obstacles to clear, the most pressing of which arrived in the form of Silas Boone on a Wednesday morning, when Boone rode onto the Lazier property with 2 men Josephine did not recognize, and an official-looking document that he presented to Roscoe at the front gate, with the practiced satisfaction of a man who has been planning something for a long time. The document was a claim against the Lazier water rights, filed through the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe, arguing that the underlying debt Roscoe carried from his bad cattle season 2 years prior constituted a lien against the property's water access rights under a provision of New Mexico territorial law that Boone's lawyer had apparently located through considerable effort. It was legal. It was also deeply predatory, and it was constructed to move faster than Roscoe could respond. "You have 10 days to contest this filing," Boone said. in the smooth tone of a man who does not believe the contest will succeed, or the water rights transfer is confirmed. Josephine was at the ranch that morning. She had ridden out to bring some school books for Clara, who was home with a mild cold, and she stood behind Roscoe as Boone delivered this news, and she read the document over his shoulder, and her bookkeeper's mind went to work immediately, moving through the numbers and the legal language with the same precision that had made her valuable to Gerald Prentice, and that had also, ultimately, been his undoing. She saw it on the second reading. A flaw in the filing, not a moral flaw but a procedural one. A failure in the documentation chain that meant the underlying debt instrument Boone was relying on had not been properly recorded with the county clerk at the time of origination. Under territorial law, an unrecorded debt instrument could not serve as the basis for a property lien claim. "This debt," she said to Roscoe, quietly, as Boone and his men rode away, "the original note. Do you have the original paperwork?" "In the house," Roscoe said. He was still looking at the road where Boone had gone, with that expression of contained weariness she had seen on their first meeting. "Get it," Josephine said. She spent 3 hours at the kitchen table with every document Roscoe had relating to the debt, his original cattle loan, the payment records, the notes from the creditor. She found what she was looking for in the origination papers. The recording stamp from the county clerk's office was dated 3 weeks after the note itself, meaning the debt instrument had been in existence for 3 weeks before it was recorded. Under the provision Boone was relying on, the lien right only attached to properly recorded instruments. An instrument that had been in existence unrecorded could not retroactively create a lien right against property acquired during the unrecorded period, which included the water rights improvement Roscoe had filed in that same gap. It was technical and it was specific, and it was, if correctly argued, a complete defense. Josephine wrote it out in her clear, precise bookkeeper's hand, every step of the legal reasoning, with the relevant document references cited alongside. She wrote it the way she had always written financial analyses, clean, sequential, irrefutable, and she slid it across the table to Roscoe and said, "This is your contest." He read it slowly twice and then looked up at her. "How did you find this?" "Numbers and documents are what I know," she said. "The same skill that got me into trouble with Prentice is the same skill that is useful now." He looked at her for a long moment with something in his expression she could not immediately name, and then she identified it. It was the look of a man who has just understood that the person sitting across from him is not what he thought she was, not lesser than he thought, but enormously more than he had been able to see. "Josephine," he said. "Do not make it sentimental," she said briskly. "Take it to Alderman Webb in Socorro. Get on your horse today. You have 10 days. He rode to Socorro that afternoon and returned the following evening with word from Alderman Webb that the contest was solid, the legal argument was sound, and that Webb would file it with the Territorial Land Office by the end of the week. The filing went through. Silas Boone's claim was reviewed by a territorial land court judge who agreed with the procedural objection in a ruling delivered at the end of April, 3 days before Boone's deadline expired. The water rights remained with the Lazy R Ranch. Silas Boone was furious. He came to the ranch one last time without his hired men, just himself on his horse at the front gate, and he said things to Roscoe that were unpleasant about the kind of woman who meddles in men's business and the kind of man who lets her. Roscoe listened without expression until Boone was finished, and then said very quietly, "Do not come to this property again." It was said in a tone that even Silas Boone understood was not a negotiating position. Boone left. He did not come back. Meanwhile, the letter at Mrs. Farrow's boarding house in Abilene went out on schedule in early April. Josephine knew this because she received a brief reply from Mrs. Farrow, a kind woman who had mailed the letter to the county sheriff exactly as instructed, and had included a note of her own expressing hope that Josephine was safe and well. The county sheriff of Dickinson County, Kansas, opened an investigation into Gerald Prentice's accounts within 2 weeks. Josephine received this information through a letter from the county attorney's office, which had tracked her location through the school board's correspondence, requesting her cooperation as a witness. She wrote back with a full statement, 12 pages in her clear bookkeeper's hand, detailing everything she had discovered in Prentice's hidden ledgers. She mailed it to the county attorney in Abilene, and then she sat for a long time in her small house behind Dorothea Vance's boarding house and felt the specific relief of a person who has been carrying a dark secret for a long time and has finally set it down. Gerald Prentice was charged with fraud and tax evasion in May of 1884. Josephine was informed by the county attorney's office that her statement was sufficient and that her physical presence in Abilene would not be required for the initial proceedings. The trap she had been living inside for 4 months was, at last, dismantled. She went to the Lazier to tell Roscoe, riding out on a warm afternoon in late May when the desert was doing something almost gentle with the light, the grasses along the creek bottom going bright green from the spring runoff. He was on the porch when she arrived, mending a harness with the patient, repetitive motions of a man who is comfortable with work that takes time. He looked up and read her face, as he had gotten very good at doing, and said, "It is over, then." "It is over," she said. He set down the harness and stood up and came down the porch steps to where she was standing, and he took both her hands in his large, careful ones, and he said, "You are free." The word landed in her chest like water in dry ground. Free. She had not thought of it in those terms, but that was precisely what it was. The hidden motive was gone, the trap was dismantled, the forced choice between safety and honesty had been resolved in favor of both. The dark past was behind her, not erased, but settled the way a storm settles into a clear day. "I do not want to go back," she said, "to Abilene, to any of it." "No one is asking you to go back," he said. "I want to stay here," she said, and she meant Blue Rock, she meant the school. She meant this valley with its blue mountains and its enormous sky, and she meant all of it, but she also meant him specifically, and she was looking at him directly when she said it, so there was no ambiguity about what she was including in the word here. "Then stay," he said. It was simple and complete and entirely, devastatingly what she needed to hear. He kissed her then in the late May light, standing in the yard of the Lazier Ranch with the mountains blue in the west and the creek running bright below the ridge. And it was not a tentative kiss, but a thorough and serious one. The kiss of people who have been toward each other for a long time and have at last run out of reasons to detour. Clara, watching from the porch with the composed satisfaction of someone whose plan has succeeded exactly as intended, said, to no one in particular, "Well, finally." Summer came to Blue Rock in full and golden force, and Josephine taught through the last weeks of the school year, and then closed the schoolroom for the summer term and spent her days in a state of happiness she kept examining suspiciously, the way you examine a gift you are not sure you deserve. She and Roscoe moved between his ranch and her rooms in town with an informality that the community watched and accepted and largely approved of, because Blue Rock was a small town with practical views about how life should be organized, and because it was obvious to anyone paying attention that these two people were good for each other in concrete and observable ways. She spent evenings at the ranch, where she had set up a writing desk in the corner of the sitting room, and Roscoe would be reading or doing his own work at the other end of the table, and Clara would be in her room, and the particular quiet of that arrangement, companionable, unhurried, real, was the thing Josephine had not known she was longing for during all the years of careful solitude in Abilene. Not excitement, not rescue. Just this, a life inhabited by more than one person, warm in the lamplight present. Roscoe was not without his difficult edges. He carried grief the way all people carry profound loss, not always visibly, but persistently, in the particular way he looked at Clara sometimes, or in the moments of silence that came on him without apparent cause. He had a stubbornness of his own that matched hers in kind if not in style, and they argued sometimes genuinely, fully, The way people argue when they take each other seriously about things that ranged from the management of the ranch to questions of principle to, once memorably, the correct method of canning tomatoes, which ended in both of them laughing at themselves with the specific laughter of people who have discovered that they can fight and still like each other afterward. He told her once, lying on a blanket on the porch in the late summer dark watching the stars, that he had not expected to feel like this again. He said it carefully because he was a careful man with words that mattered to him. Like what? Josephine said. Like the world is being run by somebody who knows what they are doing, he said, which made her laugh and then made her quiet. I'm not sure I believe that, she said, about the world being run that way. Neither am I mostly, he said, but sometimes it feels like it. He asked her to marry him in September. He did it properly, with no theater, just the two of them on the porch after Clara was in bed, and the Milky Way overhead like spilled flour across black velvet, and his voice even and direct and steady, the way he was in all the moments that mattered to him most. He told her he was not a man with a great deal to offer in material terms. The ranch was solvent now but not prosperous, and life in Blue Rock was not a life of comfort by any standard a person could objectively apply. He told her he understood that she had her own work and her own mind, and that he was not asking her to subordinate either of those things. He told her that he loved her, simply and without elaboration, and asked if she would be willing to build something with him. She said yes before he had quite finished the question, which made him stop mid-sentence and look at her with those dark eyes full of something wonderful, and she said, "Yes. The answer is yes. You can finish your speech if you want to, but the answer is yes." "I was almost done anyway," he said. "I know," she said. "I let you get through the important parts." They were married in October, in the Blue Rock Church, on a morning of such extravagant clarity that the sky looked painted. Dorothea Vance cried with the unapologetic enthusiasm of a woman who has been hoping for this outcome for months. Sheriff Sam Briggs shook Roscoe's hand for a long time and said something quietly that made Roscoe nod with great seriousness. Alderman Webb had ridden up from Soccer Row for the occasion and was observed to give the kind of toast at the small reception afterward that demonstrated he had genuinely known Roscoe for years and had opinions about his character that were both affectionate and accurate. Clara wore a dress that she had chosen herself practical and blue and slightly too large, which she had argued was sensible because she would grow into it, and she stood beside Josephine during the ceremony with the contained pride of someone who has accomplished something significant. When Josephine looked down at her during the vows, Clara met her eyes with a gaze of such clear and simple love that Josephine had to press her lips together to keep her composure. After the ceremony, when the community had gathered in the churchyard for the reception, and the long trestle tables were set with food that half the town had contributed, Clara came and found Josephine sitting for a moment in a quiet corner of the porch away from the noise. Clara sat down beside her without preamble, in the direct way she had always had, and took Josephine's hand in both of her small ones. Then she pressed her cheek against Josephine's palm, the way she sometimes did when she was being affectionate, closing her eyes and holding still. And then she said it, the words that would live in Josephine's memory for the rest of her life, bright and permanent as stars. "You smell like someone who belongs here." Josephine looked up and found Roscoe in the doorway, just arrived from the yard, still in his good coat with his hat in his hand, and he had heard it. She knew he had heard it from the way his face changed, every defense and every practiced steadiness dissolving at once, leaving something wide open and bare and wholly, undeniably tender. For a moment none of them moved. Clara sat with her cheek on Josephine's palm, eyes closed, entirely peaceful. Josephine looked at Roscoe. Roscoe looked at Josephine. The desert wind moved through the yard, carrying sage and warmth and the sound of people they knew celebrating something real. Then Josephine said to the child very softly, "I belong here because of you, because of both of you." Clara opened her eyes and considered this seriously, as she considered all things. "That is what I thought," she said, with the satisfaction of a confirmed hypothesis, and went back to the reception to eat cake. Roscoe crossed the porch to where Josephine was sitting and stood beside her, and she reached up and took his hand, and he held it in both of his, and neither of them said anything for a while, because the moment was already complete, and additional words would only have diminished it. Winter came to the high desert of New Mexico with its particular severity, cold nights that crackled with clarity, days of brilliant frozen sunshine, the mountains going white from the summit down. Josephine kept the school running through the winter term, walking to the schoolroom in the cold mornings with her coat buttoned high and her breath visible in the air, coming home in the afternoons to the ranch house that was now, entirely and without qualification, her home. She threw herself into the life of the ranch with the same energy she brought to teaching, learning cattle management and water schedules, and the particular political geography of neighboring properties, all of which she found genuinely interesting because she found systems interesting, the way things connected and balanced and operated. Roscoe and she talked business the way they talked everything, directly, as equals, with the understanding that she might disagree, and he might be wrong, and both of those outcomes were acceptable and interesting rather than threatening. She wrote regularly to the county attorney's office in Abilene through the fall. Gerald Prentice was tried in November of 1884 and convicted on 3 counts of fraud. He was sentenced to 4 years in the Kansas State Penitentiary. His dry goods business was dissolved, and the assets distributed among the suppliers he had defrauded. The county attorney wrote to Josephine personally to thank her for the detailed and legally precise statement she had provided, which he described as the clearest and most useful piece of documentary evidence the prosecution had relied upon. She folded that letter and put it in the small cedar box where she kept her important papers, alongside the deed to her teaching credentials and Clara's first drawing of a map, and the little telegram stub from the message Roscoe had sent to Socorro back in March, which she had kept without knowing entirely why. Together those scraps constituted the paper record of how her life had changed, and she looked at them sometimes in the particular way you look at evidence of a journey when you have safely arrived. Spring came again, her first full spring in Blue Rock, and the desert was extraordinary with it, wildflowers in the arroyos, the creek running high with snowmelt, the sky going through its repertoire of color with the daily dedication of a painter who has a long commission and no shortage of material. Clara was 7 now and growing with the serious efficiency of a healthy child, her interest in maps having expanded to include a fascination with weather patterns, which she tracked in a dedicated notebook and which she periodically presented to Josephine for educational validation. It was in March, the same month that had been so catastrophic the previous year, and that was now entirely remade in Josephine's experience of time, that she told Roscoe she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen over morning coffee, with the matter-of-fact directness that had become their shared language, and she watched his face go through a sequence of expressions so rapid and unguarded that she could not have named them all surprise, something bright, something almost reverent, something complicated with the knowledge of what he had lost before, and then, settling, a warmth so complete and steady it made everything else small. "Are you well?" he said. The question was precise and came first before everything else, before his own response to the news, and it was exactly the right question. "Very well," she said, "and very certain." He came around the table and sat beside her instead of across from it, which was a departure from his usual position, and he took her hands and held them, and they sat like that for a long time, in the spring morning, in the kitchen that smelled of coffee and wood smoke, and the particular dry sweetness of the desert coming in through the open window. Clara was told that evening and received the information with characteristic composure, asked several questions of a practical nature, and then announced that if the baby was a boy, she had thoughts about suitable names which she would provide in writing. Josephine told her that was an excellent and organized approach to the situation. Roscoe suggested that perhaps they should wait to know the sex before composing lists. Clara said that was wasteful of preparation time, and produced a small notebook in which she had already begun the list. The name at the top was, of course, Orion. The pregnancy went well through the spring and summer. Josephine continued teaching until August, when the heat and the increasing awkwardness of her condition made the long days impractical, and handed the school over to a capable young woman named Harriet Price, who had come from the East looking for work, and who proved a competent substitute. Josephine stayed involved with the school as a consulting presence. She could not entirely remove herself from a project she had built and in which she had genuine investment, but she was home at the ranch through the late summer, which was its own particular life. Roscoe was attentive through the pregnancy in the quietly practical way. He was attentive to everything that mattered to him, making sure she rested, making sure she ate, managing the ranch work so that she was not left alone at distance from help, riding to Socorro to consult with a physician about what normal and abnormal conditions to watch for. He never hovered. He managed the balance between presence and freedom with the same instinct that made him good with horses there, available, watchful but never crowding. On a night in late September, with the first suggestion of autumn in the air and the stars doing something magnificent through the ranch house window, their son was born. He was healthy and large and announced his arrival with considerable noise, which the midwife, Dorothea Vance's niece, said was an excellent sign. Roscoe held him for a long time after, standing at the window in the dawn light, and Josephine watched them both and felt the specific and complicated gratitude of someone who has come through difficulty to arrive at something they did not know was possible. They named him Daniel. Clara's list of suggested names remained available as a reference, but Daniel was the name Josephine had carried privately for months, after her father, and when she said it aloud, Roscoe said it suited him without hesitation. Clara met her brother with the measured enthusiasm of a scientist, encountering a significant new specimen. She studied him carefully for several minutes and then said, "He has very good hands for a small person." This was accepted as high praise. The years that followed were the kind of years that are difficult to summarize because their value lies in their ordinariness, in the repetition and the accumulation of ordinary days that are full enough to be worth living and connected enough to give each other meaning. Josephine returned to teaching when Daniel was 3 months old, bringing him with her to the schoolroom in the mornings, in a cradle that sat in the corner, and that he outgrew before the spring term ended. The community of Blue Rock came to regard this as entirely normal, and several of the older children took turns walking him when he was restless, which he accepted with an equanimity that suggested he was his father's son. Clara turned 8, and 9, and 10, acquiring opinions and expertise in equal measure, becoming a child of such formidable intellectual character that Josephine occasionally looked at her across the dinner table and felt something like awed respect, which was a response she had not expected to feel so regularly toward a person of that age. Roscoe watched Clara grow with the bittersweet attention of a parent who understands that growth is the purpose and also the loss, and Josephine watched him watch Clara and loved him for the tenderness and the courage of it. The Laziar expanded slowly and steadily over those years. Roscoe hired 2 permanent ranch hands brothers named Cisco and Mateo Reyes, who were efficient and honest, and who became part of the extended family of the ranch in the way that good work and shared purpose tend to create family even where none exists by blood. The cattle operation grew. Roscoe negotiated a new water agreement with 2 neighboring ranches that was mutually beneficial, and that finally put to rest the kind of vulnerability to people like Silas Boone that had nearly cost him everything. Boone himself moved his operation east, reportedly following some failed venture in land speculation, and the community of Blue Rock did not mourn his absence. The territory around them changed steadily through the late 1880s. More settlement, the railroad extending its reach, the particular character of the frontier beginning its long, uneven transformation into something more ordinary and more regulated. Josephine paid attention to these changes with the interest of someone who understood systems, noting the ways in which increased legal structure brought protection for some and displacement for others, including the Navajo and Apache communities, whose presence in the wider territory was increasingly pressured by federal policy in ways that Josephine found deeply troubling and said so. In the direct way she said things she believed. Roscoe had grown up around those communities and had more complex feelings, not simple and not complacent, but weighted with the specific discomfort of someone who has benefited from arrangements whose injustice he cannot entirely resolve. They talked about it honestly, as they talked about everything honestly, and those conversations did not end in resolution, because there was no personal resolution available to them, only witness and acknowledgement and the determination to be decent in their own conduct. Daniel was walking before his first birthday and talking shortly after, and combining those two capabilities in ways that kept the household in a state of productive chaos. He was a warm, physical child, given to hugging, given to climbing, given to the direct and enthusiastic expression of his feelings that stood in interesting contrast to both his sister's careful reserve and his father's measured quiet. He got both from Josephine, who had suppressed those qualities for years under the necessity of professional composure, and who found, in the uncomplicated acceptance of her own home, that she was more naturally demonstrative than she had ever allowed herself to be. She was happy. Not simply or without complication. Life did not operate that way, but genuinely, foundationally happy in the way that is built from real things. Meaningful work, respected partnership, children who were loved and well, a community in which she was known and valued, and a man who had never once in all their years together made her feel that her intelligence was a difficulty to be managed rather than a part of her to be received. Roscoe turned 35 that winter, and she organized a celebration for him that involved the entire community. A dinner at the church hall that Dorothea Vance and several other women helped prepare, attended by everyone who counted in Blue Rock and the surrounding ranches. He was visibly surprised and visibly moved and pretended not to be either, in the particular way of men who have learned that feeling things openly is a vulnerability, and who spend their lives slowly unlearning that lesson in the presence of people who are safe. Josephine watched him across the crowded hall, talking to Sam Briggs and laughing at something, Daniel on his hip, and she felt the fullness of the life they had made together as a physical sensation, something real and solid and good. She found him later that evening on the porch of the ranch house, after Clara had taken Daniel inside and the last of the guests had gone, and she sat beside him in the dark and the quiet, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into his side, and they stayed like that for a long time watching the stars. "What are you thinking about?" she said, eventually. "How I almost lost this place," he said. "2 years ago, I was so close to losing it. And now?" She said, "Now it is more than I had before," he said, "which is strange to understand. I thought I was defending what I had, but what I had then is smaller than what I have now." She thought about her own version of that arithmetic, the life she had defended herself into in Abilene, the careful construction of solitary safety that had been, she understood now, not safety at all but a kind of poverty, the hidden ledgers that had forced her out into the open. The train south from Kansas in the March dark, one trunk and $214, and a newspaper advertisement folded in her pocket. The man at the general store who had asked questions she had been afraid to answer. And then Blue Rock and Dorothea Vance, and a schoolroom with a broken shutter, and a serious small girl who read maps and named things Orion, And Roscoe, who had stood very still in the face of something mean, and then, when she was the one facing something mean, had stood beside her without being asked. "It is strange," she agreed. "The things that looked like disaster while they were happening. The letter in Abilene," he said. "If you had not left when you did, if you had not sent that telegram to Socorro, if Clara had not decided she needed to learn maps," he said. They laughed quietly in the dark, the particular laughter of people who have traced their good fortune back along its improbable thread and found themselves astonished by the contingency of it. "Roscoe," she said, "I am expecting again." The arm around her tightened. He turned his head and she could feel the change in his breathing, the same sequence of expressions she had seen before, though she could not see his face this time. "When," he said, "July, I think." He pressed his mouth against her hair and stayed there for a moment, and she felt the full weight of what he was feeling in that contact: gratitude, love, the particular kind of reverence that comes to people who have lost things and know the value of what they hold. "Are you well?" he said, again, first, always the right question. "Very well," she said, very certain. The second baby was a girl. She arrived in the heat of July with the practical efficiency of someone who had considered the alternatives and found them wanting. And she was small and dark-haired and fierce in a way that made the midwife laugh with recognition. They named her Ellen, after Roscoe's first wife, and this was Josephine's suggestion, made without jealousy or insecurity, but with the simple clarity of a woman who understood that love is not a competition, and that honoring what came before is part of building something that lasts. Roscoe went very quiet when she said the name, and then he nodded once slowly, and said, "Thank you," in a tone that carried more weight than those two words should be able to carry. Josephine had to look away, because his gratitude was too large to receive directly. Clara, now 9 years old and of the opinion that all significant family matters fell within her consultative purview, approved the name with the magnanimity of someone who had expected to be consulted, and was not surprised to find that people had chosen wisely in her absence. She established herself as Ellen's primary educational resource on a timeline she described as soon as possible, meaning approximately 6 months from now, when she will be capable of basic receptive language. Daniel, 2 years old and golden and full of an expansiveness that was entirely his own, regarded his new sister with the broad generosity of a good-natured boy who has enough affection for everyone, and said "baby" in a tone of pleased discovery, as though this was something that had occurred to him spontaneously rather than been explained for weeks. Life on the Lazier continued and deepened and expanded. Josephine took back the school fully when Ellen was 4 months old, bringing her along in the same cradle that Daniel had used, which still sat in the corner where it had been placed during his infancy, and which Harriet Price had kept polished and ready. The community of Blue Rock had by now entirely assimilated Josephine into its structure. She was the school teacher, and she was Roscoe Reed's wife, and she was Clara's stepmother, and she was someone who spoke her mind at town meetings and sat on the school board and wrote letters to the county commissioner when she thought something was wrong, which was frequently enough to keep the commissioner in a mild state of attention. She wrote occasionally to Mrs. Farrow in Abilene, and Mrs. Farrow wrote back with news of the town, and with the pleasure of a woman who has performed a small brave act mailing that letter, and has had the satisfaction of seeing it do some good. Josephine once told Roscoe that she owed Mrs. Farrow more than she could calculate, because without that letter as insurance she would never have had the courage to run, and without the courage to run she would never have boarded a train south, and without that train she would never have arrived in Blue Rock, and without Blue Rock there would have been none of this. "I should send Mrs. Farrow a very nice gift," she said. "What kind of gift?" he said. Josephine thought about it. "Something useful and unexpected," she said. She is that kind of person. She sent Mrs. Farrow a hand-embroidered quilt that Dorothea Vance helped her make, which took 3 months of evenings, and was one of the most beautiful things Josephine had ever participated in creating. And Mrs. Farrow wrote back with a letter that made Josephine cry in the good way. Clara graduated from the Blue Rock School at 12, having exhausted everything Josephine could formally teach her, and began a correspondence course through a women's educational institution in the East that provided advanced studies in mathematics and natural science. She was, by any measure, exceptional, not the comfortable exceptional of a child who is simply bright in an undemanding environment, but the kind that would have been remarkable in any context, the kind that needed feeding with difficult things in order to stay fully alive. Josephine advocated for her with fierce, specific purpose. She wrote letters to educational institutions, corresponded with teachers and scholars, obtained books through the county library system that had to be ordered from as far away as St. Louis. Roscoe supported this with the uncomplicated conviction of a father who trusts his child's nature and does not require it to fit a shape he has predetermined. "She will go east for school eventually," Josephine told him one evening, "the way you say something you have been thinking for a while and have decided needs to be said." "I know," he said. He sounded like he had known it for some time. "That will be hard," she said. "Yes," he said. "It will be hard and it will be right, and both of those things can be true at once." She put down her book and looked at him. "You are a remarkable person," she said. He looked up from his own reading with a slightly surprised expression, as though the remark had arrived unexpectedly. "What brings that on?" "I just thought it," she said, "and I decided to say it." He went back to his reading, but she could see that he was pleased, in the private, contained way he was pleased by things he valued. He did not need constant affirmation, which was fortunate because she was not someone who provided it constantly. But when she gave it, she meant it without qualification, and he knew that. Ellen grew from fierce infancy into fierce childhood, with a consistency that was almost amusing in its predictability. She had opinions at 2 years old, and arguments for those opinions at 3, and the vocabulary to articulate both at 4. And the household adapted around her energy, the way a river adapts around a new stone. She and Daniel were entirely different people who loved each other with the specific, uncomplicated devotion of siblings who have never been asked to compete for love, and therefore do not. Daniel was 7 when he announced his intention to be a cattle rancher, which given his origins and environment surprised no one, and he began following Roscoe around the ranch with a dedication that was both endearing and occasionally impractical. Roscoe taught him with patient thoroughness how to read cattle, how to assess water, how to work with rather than against the particular moods of horses, how to repair fence and maintain equipment and observe weather. The transmission of practical knowledge from father to son through the patient medium of daily work was one of the oldest stories in human life, and watching it made Josephine understand things about continuity and meaning that she had not previously had words for. Ellen declared at 5 that she intended to be a doctor. Josephine, who had learned not to underestimate the declarations of her children, began immediately thinking about what books to obtain and what correspondence to initiate, and Roscoe said, "Of course she will," in the tone of a man who has entirely recalibrated his sense of what is possible in the world. There were difficult seasons, because there always are. A drought in the late 1880s that reduced the grass and required careful management of the cattle numbers, and some genuine privation in terms of what the ranch could produce. A winter when Daniel was sick with a persistent lung ailment that kept them all frightened for 3 weeks before resolving cleanly. A year when the school board and the county seat made decisions about curriculum that Josephine found both wrong and foolish, and fought against with an energy that Roscoe privately described to Sam Briggs as formidable, and that Briggs, who had known Josephine for years, described simply as Josephine. She won that particular fight, or won enough of it to protect what mattered most in the curriculum, and the county school board came to regard her correspondence with a mixture of respect and wariness that she found entirely satisfactory. The decade turned. 1890 arrived, and with it the particular quality of change that comes when a place has been fully settled and is beginning to understand itself as a community with a past rather than simply a frontier with a future. Blue Rock had grown from 300 souls to nearly 600. There was a newspaper now, a modest weekly, and a new church, and a telegraph office, and a doctor had established a practice. A thin, precise man from Boston named Dr. Holloway, who proved to be good at what he did, and who became the person Josephine directed all of Ellen's medical questions toward, to the mutual benefit of both. Clara was 15 and deep in her correspondence studies, and already being written to by the Women's College in Tennessee that she had identified as her educational destination. She was formidably prepared and formidably motivated, and the question of her going east for school had shifted from an uncertain future eventuality to a concrete upcoming reality. Roscoe and Josephine had long conversations about it in the evenings, and the conversations were always honest and never easy and always arrived at the same conclusion, that Clara's full life required more than Blue Rock could contain, and love meant supporting that rather than holding it back. Clara left for Tennessee in September of 1891, when she was 16 years old. She went on the stage to Socorro and then the train east, with 2 trunks and a leather satchel full of notebooks, and a copy of David Copperfield that Josephine had given her years ago, finally her own. Roscoe lifted her luggage and kept his face composed and held her for a long time at the Socorro stage depot, and Josephine held her after and said, quietly, "Write to us every week and argue with everyone and do not apologize for knowing things." Clara said, "I know." And then, with the precision she brought to everything that mattered, she said, "You gave me everything I needed to go. That is the best thing a parent can do." She said parent without qualification, and Josephine understood that this included her, had included her for a long time, and she pressed her lips together very hard and nodded and did not cry until the stage had moved and Roscoe had put his arm around her, and Clara's face was no longer visible through the window. She was not gone from their lives, of course. She wrote every week as instructed, long letters full of detail and opinion, and occasionally drawings. She had discovered a talent for technical illustration in her natural science coursework that was apparently making her science professors very pleased. She came home for the summers of her first 2 years, and the ranch was full of her in those weeks, her particular quality of attention at the dinner table, her morning habit of sitting on the porch with coffee and a book, her patience with Daniel and her delight in Ellen, her long evening conversations with Roscoe that resumed exactly where they had always been, the easy intellectual equality of a father and daughter who genuinely like each other. The autumn of 1892, Josephine turned 35, and the community threw her a celebration in the church hall with the same warmth and enthusiasm they had given Roscoe 7 years before, which she received with a grace she had had to learn, the grace of allowing yourself to be celebrated without immediately deflecting it toward someone else, the particular skill of a woman who has spent years being useful and is still learning to accept being valued. Roscoe gave a speech. He was not a speaking man, not publicly, and he stood at the front of the hall with his hat in his hand and said, carefully, that he wanted to describe what kind of person Josephine Kendrick was. He said she was the kind of person who read hidden ledgers and told the truth about them even when the truth was dangerous. He said she was the kind of person who found a legal defense for a water rights claim in a pile of ranch documents on a kitchen table. He said she was the kind of person who suggested naming a baby after a woman she had never met, because love is not diminished by being shared, and she understood that better than anyone. He said she was the kind of person who taught maps when a child asked for maps, which turned out to matter more than either of them had known. He said all of this in the quiet, even voice that made everything he said sound like established fact rather than opinion, and the hall was very quiet by the end of it. Then Dorothea Vance started crying again, and Daniel, 10 years old, not entirely clear on the tone of the occasion, started laughing at Dorothea crying. And Ellen, 7 and fierce, scolded him in a whisper so compressed with authority that it sounded like Josephine in miniature. And Roscoe caught Josephine's eye across the hall, and the two of them shared the specific laughter of parents who are watching their children be exactly themselves, which is the best kind of watching there is. Later, after the hall had emptied and the children were in bed, and the night was as clear and enormous as it always was in this country that had given her everything she had not known to ask for, Josephine and Roscoe sat on the porch of the Lazy R Ranch house, in the same 2 chairs they had been sitting in for years, and the stars were the same stars, and the desert wind was the same wind, and the creek was running low in the autumn drought but running, and the dogs were at their feet. And she thought about the girl she had been in Abilene with her $214 and her newspaper clipping and her terror and her plan. And she thought about who she was now, in this place, in this life with these people, and she understood, not dramatically, not with sudden revelation, but with the steady certainty of something that has been true for a long time and is only now being named, that she was home. Not just in the geographic sense, though she was that too, this red earth and wide sky and these blue mountains having become as familiar and necessary to her as breathing. But home in the deepest and most personal sense, the sense in which you occupy a life that is genuinely yours, built from your own choices and your own work and your own love, populated by people who know who you are and want you there, unburdened by secrets or hidden motives or the exhausting performance of a self that is not quite real. "What are you thinking?" Roscoe said in the dark. "That I am happy," she said, the plainest possible answer, the truest one. He turned his head and looked at her, and in the starlight she could see his face, this face she had been reading for 8 years and knew as well as her own, and what was on it was the same thing, and she did not need him to say it because she could see it and he knew she could see it, and that mutual visibility was itself a form of love. "Good," he said. She reached across the distance between their chairs and took his hand, and he held hers in both of his, and they sat like that in the enormous New Mexico night, listening to the creek and the wind and the occasional voice of a distant coyote, and above them the stars performed their slow and ancient turn, and the Lazy R Ranch was quiet and solid and full of sleeping children and the warm smell of lived-in rooms, and the life that had begun with terror and flight and a letter in a coat pocket had arrived. Through all its unlikely contingency, exactly where it was supposed to be. The years rolled forward with the easy momentum of a life that is well-founded. Clara finished her studies in Tennessee and returned, briefly, before setting out for a position with a geological survey organization in Colorado that had decided, with some encouragement from her professors, that her qualifications were unusual and valuable, and that the traditional restriction of such positions to men was perhaps not a standard that needed to be maintained quite so rigidly. She wrote from Colorado with the particular excitement of a person who is doing exactly the work they were built to do, and her letters were long and vivid, and occasionally contained hand-drawn maps that Josephine hung on the wall of the schoolroom for her students to study. Daniel grew into his father's build, and much of his father's character steady, direct, better with action than with words, excellent with animals, with a rancher's instinctive understanding of weather and water and land. He took on increasing responsibility at the Lazy R as he moved through his teenage years, working alongside Cisco and Mateo Reyes with the easy partnership of a young man who has been raised to treat people fairly regardless of station, which was a value Josephine had worked for deliberately, and which Roscoe embodied in practice without needing to articulate it. Ellen, fierce from birth and formidably focused, had by her 12th year accumulated a medical library that occupied an entire shelf of the parlor bookcase, and had conducted a correspondence with Dr. Holloway that the good doctor described as the most exhaustive medical interrogation I have sustained outside of formal examination. She was going to be a doctor. Everyone in Blue Rock accepted this as established fact, including people who had not entirely expected to find themselves accepting it, and the adjustment was interesting to watch. Josephine taught the Blue Rock School for 15 years in total, leaving it finally when Ellen left for her own Eastern schooling, and Daniel was old enough to manage the ranch with minimal parental oversight on a daily basis. She moved her energy at that point into the community more broadly. She sat on the school board formally and on the county commissioner's advisory committee for education, and she wrote, more ambitiously, a series of articles on frontier schooling for a publication based in Santa Fe that reached teachers across New Mexico territory. She was not a famous person. She was known where she lived and within the specific communities of people who cared about education and territorial governance, and she was respected in those communities with the specific, solid respect that accumulates over time through consistent, principled action. She was not famous, but she was real, and she had decided years ago that real was better. Roscoe was 52 when he had his health scare. A bad autumn when his lungs gave him trouble the way his father's had given his father trouble. Weeks of a persistent cough that frightened Josephine more than she showed, because she had learned to present calm when she felt fear, and which Dr. Holloway managed with the focused attention of a good physician, and which resolved, finally, leaving Roscoe diminished in some ways but present and stubborn, and still entirely himself. He came home from the weeks of worst illness looking thinner and more tired than she had seen him, and she took him in and managed him and sat beside him through the nights when his breathing troubled her, and when he was better and the color came back and the weight came back and he started wanting to get back to work. Always the sign with him that things were truly right. She went out to the porch and sat alone for a while and let herself feel how frightened she had been, fully and without management, because she had earned the right to feel it without anyone watching. He found her there when he was strong enough to be moving around the house more easily, and he sat beside her and looked at her face and knew what she had been carrying, and he said, "I am still here." "I know," she said. "I intend to stay for a very long time," he said. "That is not always in a person's control," she said. "No," he said, "but the intention counts for something." She looked at him, this man who had stood very still in the face of something mean on the street of a small town, and had then turned and helped a stranger stand still in the face of her own mean thing. This man who had made soup and fixed shutters and sent telegrams and given speeches and held her hand in the dark through 14 years of a shared life. And she said, "Yes, the intention counts." He reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the specific gesture of a man who has learned the particular vocabulary of one person's physicality and speaks it without thinking. And she turned her face into his hand, the way Clara had once turned her face into Josephine's palm, and she held still for a moment, receiving the warmth and the fact of him. "You smell like someone who belongs here," he said, very quietly, with the particular half-smile of a man quoting something he has held for years. She laughed, and her eyes filled, and she shook her head. "That was Clara's line," she said. "Clara was right," he said. And in the evening light of the New Mexico high desert, with the mountains blue in the west and the stars beginning to appear at the edge of the sky, and the ranch quiet around them and their lives full and real and good, there was nothing in the world left to argue with in that.